By the late 1980s, Hollywood had spent more than a century filming the Civil War without once putting the 54th Massachusetts at the center of the frame. The first all-black regiment of the North marched into history in 1863 and then somehow out of it. Most Americans had never heard the name. That changed when a 4-year studio fight and a young director with a single feature behind him pushed Glory into theaters in December 1989. It won 3 Academy Awards, and few months ago, the Library of Congress entered it into the National Film Registry. Behind the polished surface sits a stranger story, casting battles, an unscripted prayer, a continuity error no one caught, an unsolved death on set, and the historical liberties most viewers never noticed. Number 1, the statue that started it all. On Boston Common, a bronze relief catches the afternoon light along one edge, a long column of soldiers marching beside a mounted officer. The faces of the black infantrymen are all different from one another, each man modeled as an individual with his own bones and bearing and gaze, at a time when convention would have rendered them as a single anonymous mass. A screenwriter named Kevin Jarre stopped in front of it and felt the gap open under him. He could name the officer on the horse. He could not name one of the men marching beside him. And he had loved the Civil War his whole life, since the toy soldiers he lined up across the floor as a boy. This part of it he had never been taught. That gap became the reason the film exists. Jarre went looking, sought out Lincoln Kirstein, the writer and impresario who had championed the memorial for decades, and met with him in Saratoga in 1986. He read everything he could find about Colonel Robert Shaw and the 54th Massachusetts until the story had taken hold of him completely. Then he sat down in room 421 of the Gramercy Park Hotel and wrote the spec script in something like 4 weeks, a burst of work fast enough to suggest the material had been waiting in him for years. When the film finally reached a screen, Jarre slipped himself into a single shot. He is the Union soldier who watches the 54th march toward Fort Wagner and yells after them, "Give them hell, 54. Number 2, the 4-year studio odyssey. Every studio in town agreed on one thing about Kevin Jarre's script. A Civil War drama whose heroes were black soldiers carried 2 commercial fears at once: the period picture that costs a fortune and the subject matter executives privately judged unmarketable, and together that made it the kind of project that won admiration in a meeting and a pass by Friday. Proving them wrong took the better part of 4 years. The Australian director Bruce Beresford signed on first and brought veteran producer Freddie Fields in with him, and the two set the project up at Columbia Pictures. Then the ground shifted. The studio's head, David Putnam, was forced out in 1987, and the picture fell apart in the wreckage of his exit. Beresford walked away, and for a while it looked like one more admired script that would never be shot, the fate so many of them meet. Fields refused to let it die. He carried the screenplay over to TriStar, and according to Edward Zwick's 2024 memoir, the studio would commit only once Matthew Broderick agreed to star. A bankable teen comedy, Lead was the lever that finally turned the green light. The film about the men no one would finance got made on the strength of the one name the executives were willing to trust. Number 3, the producer paid Denzel himself. Years before the cameras rolled, Edward Zwick had already cast the part in his head. He had watched a young actor take command of the screen in A Soldier's Story in 1984 and again in Cry Freedom in 1987, and he knew he wanted that actor for Trip, the runaway who becomes the film's fiercest conscience. Wanting him and affording him turned out to be 2 very different problems. The budget would not stretch to the casting Zwick had in mind. To make it work, producer Freddie Fields put up part of his own producer's fee, a private bet on a performer the studio was not eager to pay for. Washington needed convincing of his own. His father-in-law held the view that integration had thinned black culture rather than strengthened it, and that argument sat with the actor as he weighed whether to sign on. Then the first dailies came back. Zwick's memoir recalls Fields watching footage of a tense scene, looking up at the screen, and letting out a stunned profane whisper that amounted to plain disbelief at what he was seeing. The gamble paid off in full. The role carried Washington from a respected working actor to a genuine star, and the slice of his own fee that Fields had risked became one of the smartest investments anyone made on the picture. Number 4, Ferris Bueller's Mom ran the show. Financing the entire film had hinged on one young star, which handed him leverage few first-build actors ever get. It also opened the door to an unusual second presence in the production, his mother. The playwright Patty Broderick attached herself to the project as a vocal advocate for her son and made her opinions impossible to ignore in the room. Broderick was carrying more than a hit comedy resume into the part of Colonel Shaw. He was under real pressure to be taken seriously after years of teen roles, and he was still recovering from the aftermath of a 1987 car accident in Northern Ireland that had killed 2 people. Shaw was a chance to grow up on screen, to trade Ferris Bueller's grin for the weight of command, and a great deal was riding on whether he could carry it. The tension finally broke at an early preview screening. According to Zwick's memoir, Broderick and his mother walked out and demanded the actor be given his own cut of the film. Zwick refused flatly because he had written final cut into his contract and had no intention of surrendering it. He later reached for one phrase to capture the whole period, calling it the theater of cruelty that was about to begin. Number 5. From Juilliard Straight to Glory. The actor cast as Thomas Earls had almost no experience in front of a camera. He came up entirely through the stage, and Glory was his first professional film. A year earlier, he had finished at Juilliard's drama division, where the faculty singled him out as the program's most outstanding student, and before that he had taken a theater degree at Stanford in 1984. He arrived with deep training and no screen instinct at all. Zwick noticed the gap on the first day. Andre Braugher struggled at the start with the small mechanics that stage acting never demands, hitting his marks and delivering the same performance take after take after take. The trouble passed quickly. Within days, he had become one of the production's revelations, an actor whose stillness in close-up read as something deep and held back. That first film opened onto a long and admired career. Braugher went on to anchor Homicide, Life on the Street, and decades later to win a fresh generation of fans on Brooklyn Nine-Nine. He died in December 2023, a long way from the Civil War picture that had handed a green Juilliard graduate his first day on any film set. Number 6. The Brutal Drill Sergeant. The Georgia heat was punishing, and the heavy wool uniforms only made it worse. For 2 solid weeks before principal photography began, the lead actors sweated their way through a real Civil War boot camp, learning to stand, to march, and to handle a period rifle the way a soldier of 1863 actually would have. The man running them through it was a hard Irish-American instructor who showed his famous pupils very little mercy. Broderick, Washington, Freeman, Braugher, and Elwes drilled side by side on rifle handling, on tight marching formations, on bayonet work, and on the unglamorous discipline of carrying themselves through long days under all that wool. None of them got special treatment for being who they were. It shows on screen in a way that cannot be coached in an afternoon. When the 54th drills and marches in the finished film, the actors move like men who have actually done the work, with a precision and a fatigue in the body that reads as true. Number 7. Fort Wagner was filmed backwards. Watch the climactic charge closely, and the ocean sits on the wrong side of the screen. In the real assault, the soldiers of the 54th attacked northward along the beach, with the Atlantic on their right. In the film, they surged the other way entirely, southward, with the water on their left the whole time. It is the kind of detail almost no one catches, and almost impossible to unsee once you have. The explanation is plain geography. The production shot the attack on Fort Wagner at Jekyll Island, Georgia, where the lay of the coastline simply ran the opposite direction, and rather than fight it, Zwick flipped the charge to match the beach he actually had. The stretch of Jekyll Island where the regiment made its doomed reversed run carries a different name today. The locals call it Glory Beach, a small monument of its own to a charge the film deliberately ran the wrong way. Number 8. Shaw's real candlesticks on screen. The production manufactured 200 replica Enfield rifles, sewed hundreds of Union and Confederate uniforms, fielded 150 cavalry mounts, and assembled 50 pieces of working artillery. Almost every piece of it was built or sourced to be correct to the period, down to details an audience would never consciously register. And then there is the one detail that stays with you. For a single shot, Zwick placed on the set a pair of silver candlesticks that had actually belonged to the real Colonel Shaw, the genuine objects that once stood on a young man's table before he marched south and was killed at 25. You could watch the film a dozen times over and never once catch them, and somehow knowing they are there changes the whole frame. It is the kind of choice that feels almost private, a small and serious offering tucked into the corner of a battle picture where almost no one will ever find it. Zwick has described the gesture as a Kubrickian touch, and he was right. Number 9. The whip was wet, and the tear was real. A few short blocks from the Savannah docks where enslaved people had once been bought and sold, the cameras rolled on the hardest scene in the entire film. Tripp, the runaway Denzel Washington plays, is bound to a post and flogged in front of the assembled regiment as punishment for trying to leave. Much of what gives it that terrible power was never written into the script, arriving instead in choices the actor and director made with the cameras already turning. Zwick told John Finn, the actor swinging the lash, to keep going and not stop no matter what, and he loaded the camera with extra film so that nothing would force a cut in the middle of a take. The instrument itself was a felt prop soaked through with water, so it would read on camera. Washington said the blow caught him for real, all the same. It was striking his back, and it genuinely hurt. The single tear that slides down his cheek in the finished shot was real, even though by his own account, he was not crying. He knelt before the take and tried to commune with the spirits of the people who had been enslaved on that ground, which still seemed to hold their memory. One piece of the scene was entirely his own invention. The deep ridge scars the camera discovers across Tripp's back when the shirt comes away were Washington's idea, added so the body itself would carry a record of every beating the character had survived long before this one. No line of dialogue ever explains them, and they do more work than most of the film's words. Number 10. The campfire scene was unwritten. On the night before the regiment films its final fatal battle, the men of the 54th draw in close around the firelight and begin to speak one after another in something that hangs between prayer and testimony. The cameras were running through all of it, and yet there were almost no written lines for the actors to say. Zwick had deliberately handed the moment over to his cast and asked them to find their own way into it with only the loosest sense of where it ought to end up. What they reached for came straight out of a real and very old tradition. The call and response testimony in the scene echoes the African-American shout, a form of communal worship carried up out of slavery and into the church, in which one voice rises and the others answer and build until the whole gathering seems to move as a single body. There is a documented account of United States colored troops doing very nearly this same thing on the night before the Battle of the Crater in 1864, soldiers testifying together in the dark ahead of an assault, many of them already sensing they would not survive. Zwick wrote in his memoir that the ensemble seemed to be hearing music he could not begin to imagine, and that in session after session a moment would surface that no one had thought to write down. It is the scene most people name when they try to locate the heart of the film. Number 11. A blooper that made the final cut. There is a number in the quartermaster scene that refuses to stay put. Storming in to demand supplies for his regiment, Colonel Shaw furiously insists on shoes for 600 soldiers, and then barely a minute of screen time later the figure has climbed to 700. Watch Broderick's face closely and you can catch the small hitch, the half-second in which he clearly waits for a cut that simply never comes. Zwick chose to let the whole take stand. It was the best version of the scene the production had, and resetting for another pass would have meant rebuilding the elaborate destruction of the quartermaster's office from scratch. So the slip rode straight into the finished film and has lived there ever since. Broderick later admitted that the battle sequences barely required any acting from him for the simple reason that the explosions going off all around him were so deafeningly loud that he was usefully afraid. The fear on his face in those shots is the real article, and no amount of direction could have improved on it. Number 12. The Harlem Boys Choir Score. In a recording studio in California, a take ended and half the crew in the room was wiping its eyes. The young singers James Horner had flown in from New York had just laid down their parts for the film, and the sound they made undid people who had walked in believing they were only there to do a job. Horner made a deliberate and pointed choice. Composers of the era reached almost by reflex for the cool, vaulted cathedral sound of English choir boys, and he went instead to the Boy Choir of Harlem, founded by Dr. Walter J. Turnbull. The thunderous music under the final charge on Fort Wagner is his own composition, though critics have long heard in it a barely disguised homage to Orff's O Fortuna from Carmina Burana. The score went on to win the 1991 Grammy for Best Instrumental Composition Written for a Film, and then the Academy passed it over completely. Horner's work earned no Oscar nomination at all, an omission historians of film music still argue about today, since the score is now widely counted among the very finest he ever wrote. Number 13. A body was found on the set. One morning, partway through the Savannah shoot, the production ran into something no one involved was ever able to explain. A middle-aged man had died, and his body was discovered in the area where the crew had been working, apparently around a day after his death. The date was February 1989. There were no apparent signs of violence. The man was described at the time as Middle Eastern in appearance, and despite the unusual attention a death on an active film set tends to draw, he was never positively identified. Who he was and how he came to be there simply went unanswered. Filming carried on, the schedule held, and the picture went forward to its release and its awards as if nothing had interrupted it. The case faded almost entirely from view and remains one of the stranger and more somber footnotes in the film's history, a real human death with no name ever attached to it and no explanation that ever came to light decades on. Number 14. Denzel's speech honored the 54th. 3 Academy Awards went to a single film on the evening of March 26, 1990. Denzel Washington won Best Supporting Actor ahead of Marlon Brando, Martin Landau, Dan Aykroyd, and Danny Aiello. Freddie Francis took the award for cinematography and Russell Williams the second one for sound, the first of 2 Oscars he would collect. His win for Dances with Wolves the following year made him the first African-American to take home 2 Academy Awards. The film had walked into the ceremony with 5 nominations in all. Washington kept his acceptance brief and turned it deliberately back toward the past, thanking Zwick, his manager, and his wife, before pausing to honor the men the entire film had been built around. He said he would like to pay homage to the 54th, the black soldiers who helped to make this country free. Number 15. From 3 theaters to a phenomenon. Almost no one actually saw the film on its opening weekend, and it still posted the best single-screen average in the entire country. It premiered in just 3 theaters in December 1989 and took in around $63,000 across the whole run. Spread over so few screens, that worked out to better than $21,000 per screen, the highest such average of any film playing anywhere that weekend. The wide release came in February, and from there a slow build of word of mouth and steady Oscar buzz carried the picture to a final domestic gross of $26.8 million against an $18 million budget. Its longest life was lived far from any box office. Eastman Kodak put up something like $2 million to send home video teaching kits out to schools across the country, which is how an entire generation of students first came to meet the men of the 54th at all. Number 16. The Flag Bearer's Medal of Honor. Wounded and bleeding on the sand wall of Fort Wagner, a single soldier of the 54th refused to let go of what he carried. Sergeant William Harvey Carney had snatched up the regiment's standard the instant the man holding it went down, and he hauled it up the slope of the parapet through a storm of gunfire on July 18, 1863, taking wound after wound and never once letting it touch the ground. His medal did not reach him until 1900, nearly 4 decades after the battle. His stand at Fort Wagner is the earliest action by an African American ever recognized with the Medal of Honor. The film never speaks his name aloud, but the great climactic charge hands its colors to a soldier who carries them forward exactly as Carney once did, so that a real and specific act of courage lives on inside an invented scene. What Carney said when he finally handed those colors off has outlasted very nearly everything else recorded about that terrible day. Bleeding from several wounds, he told the men who reached him to take the standard back and added the line that history kept. "Boys, the old flag never touched the ground." That, in the end, is what the whole film has been reaching toward underneath the battles and the boot camp and the awards. It is a story about which people a country chooses to remember and which it lets itself forget. For 100 years, the nation had mostly looked away from them. Glory opened in 3 theaters and grew slowly into something most blockbusters never become, the film that taught a generation what their textbooks had skipped. It made Denzel Washington a star, and it made the 54th Massachusetts impossible to forget. On January 28, 2026, the Library of Congress entered the film into the National Film Registry, making official what audiences had long since decided. The monument on Boston Common, the soldiers' real names, the letters waiting at Harvard, all of it stood there long before the cameras arrived. The film's gift was to make millions of people finally want to know them.